Motions. Motion. Ms. Leslie, seconded by Monsieur Thibault, moves that the second report of the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development presented on Wednesday, February 5th, 2014, be concurred in. Debate. The Honourable Member for Halifax.
Yeah, bravo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleagues for such a warm welcome when we've been here so long. It's hard to be warm these days. I am moving concurrence on a report from the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. I'm a member of that committee, and the report is called Terrestrial Habitat Conservation in Canada. Why did we study this? That's a good question. I'm going to go back a little bit on why we even have a report on terrestrial conservation. I don't actually remember which throne speech it was, but a couple of throne speeches ago, we had some hints that government was going to move a conservation strategy. And that, you know, it's not bad news. I mean, that's ostensibly good news. So we were excited to see what was going to happen with that. And then Environment Committee was tasked with doing a study on what a conservation plan would look like. And on its face, that actually seems like really good parliamentary procedure. We have an idea from government. We're going to task a committee to study something and get some really good information so we could give advice to the minister. So on its face, as I said, that seems wonderful and it's exciting to actually do good parliamentary work at committee. But you know what happened? It went off the rails a little bit, Mr. Speaker. I know it's hard to imagine in this environment. Where we started was a conservation study, just general conservation study. And so my colleagues and I, we would show up and we would be keen and well-researched and we would ask questions to the witnesses about conservation. What would a conservation plan look like? What would that kind of strategy look like? And it was interesting. There were moments where it was very frustrating because for some reason the Conservatives didn't want to hear anything about climate change when it comes to conservation. It's interesting because conservation actually is a good solution to climate change on a lot of fronts. For example, if you're preserving large tracts of land, you're keeping the vegetation that's there. It's basically a carbon storage, a natural carbon storage. So we heard some interesting testimony about climate change and how conservation would actually help us deal with the effects of climate change, help us actually prevent climate change from advancing. And we also heard some really interesting testimony about the impacts of climate change on conservation efforts, the fact that we're going to have to adapt a little bit. If we're going to create parks, for example, we need to think about extreme meteorological events. We need to think about the impact of waves and tides and storms on our infrastructure. So good testimony. And remember, this is not the current study that I'm talking, or the current report that I'm talking about for this concurrence motion. It's the report before. So good information, good testimony about climate. None of it's in the report. None of it. Right? And we have to remember that Conservatives do have a majority on these committees, so what comes out at the end, you know, we can fight in camera to try and get stuff in that report, and it doesn't end up in the report. So nothing about climate change. Absolutely silent. So back to this idea of studying conservation generally. Like I said, there was good testimony. We were pretty excited. We were thinking that this was our way to contribute to the parliamentary process, the democratic process. We were going to give some advice to the minister. And despite the fact that climate change didn't make it in the report, there were some other positives about the report. So we had these moments of feeling like, yeah, we're part of a parliamentary project here. This is a worthwhile endeavor. So then, as you know, Mr. Speaker, we go in camera to decide next committee business. And all kinds of ideas. The NDP has all kinds of ideas. We put forward so many motions. We put forward a motion that our committee review the government's sectoral approach to greenhouse gas regulation and review the delays in establishing those regulations for the oil and gas sector. We put forward a motion on Great Lakes and the water levels and how climate change is impacting those water levels. We put forward a motion about the Arctic, a study on the impacts of climate change and resulting new resource development and transportation routes on the Arctic, its environment, species, and ecological balance. We came armed with so many good ideas. As you know, we go in camera, majority rules. What do we come out with? A report on, not a report, a study on urban conservation. Yeah, so we went from conservation to urban conservation. Okay, so we try to be optimistic, we try to be full of energy, and it's like, okay, another conservation study, here we go. Maybe there's a point to the urban conservation study, right? Because also, in some musings that the government had, they talked about creation of a national park called Rouge Park. A national park that would be an urban park. Canada, I think North America's first urban national park. Pretty exciting stuff. So there's a glimmer again of this ability to contribute to the parliamentary process and government decision making. Okay, so another study on conservation, but at least it's on something where maybe there's a hope that the minister's listening, and we can talk about some important issues that we'll see the results of in a bill about Rouge Park. So we start our study. Of course, there's some great testimony from people about urban conservation, the way that people can connect with the natural environment while living in cities, living in urban environments. We heard really good testimony about climate change. And the way that climate, we can mitigate the impacts of climate change. We can actually mitigate the fact that climate is changing. There are things we need to do to adapt when we're looking at urban conservation and climate change. Of course, none of that ended up in the report because we can't talk about climate change at the Environment Committee. It's quite amazing. So we do this study on urban conservation, and it's interesting because this week, my apologies, Friday of last week, government actually tabled a bill on Scarborough Rouge Park, so the creation of this park. And I believe it may be on the docket to talk about today, so I've been madly prepping to speak to this bill. And it's been really difficult because, I read the bill yesterday. Don't tell anyone, but it was during my caucus meeting. We had a briefing. I just told everybody, I know. We had a briefing on it from the minister yesterday afternoon, minister's office. So we're scrambling to give some feedback about this bill when we haven't had the time to do a proper analysis. I've read it, but I haven't digested it. I haven't had time to reach out to stakeholders and get their advice on what's in this bill and if it's doing what it purports to do. But I will tell you, I have had the time to look at our notes from that urban conservation study. There was actually a small section on Rouge Park that we did in that study. And look at the bill, and I'm not seeing, it's not apparent to me where those suggestions from our witnesses are in this final bill. So at the time, you know how I felt a bit discouraged that we were doing urban conservation right on the heels of a conservation study. But I thought, well, maybe we will have an impact on the legislation. Maybe we are giving advice to the minister, which is what committees are supposed to be doing. Maybe it will be in this bill. Well, I have the bill. Perhaps it will become clearer to me later when I listen to the minister's speech, but I don't see that good advice from the witnesses that we heard at committee. I don't see it reflected in the legislation. So I've gone from being, a little disheartened by doing 2 studies in a row on the same subject to feeling like, what is the point of us even doing these studies if the minister isn't listening? We didn't choose the study topic. Right? I'll leave it to everybody's imagination. The majority on the committee probably made that decision to study these topics. I wanted to study climate change. I wanted to study some other things, but let's make the best of it if we're doing conservation. But then the results of our report aren't even reflected in the bill. So that's 2 studies. That's 2 studies on conservation. We finish this study on urban conservation. If my memory serves me correctly, I do actually think we managed to work in a rare show of collaboration with the Parliamentary Secretary to Environment, and I think we had a unanimous report on urban conservation. There's nothing egregious in it. We pointed out that it's missing a lot of things, but the information that was in there was accurate. No discussion of climate change, which we pointed out. So then we go in camera and we make decisions about what are we going to study next. And it's on the public record that the NDP put forward some incredible motions, like that we do a study on the implementation of the Species at Risk Act, its implementation and funding. That's a really important issue right now. It's one of the only pieces of environmental legislation that wasn't gutted in the 2012 omnibus budgets. We put on the record that we wanted to do a study on the impacts of budget cuts, speaking of budgets, on the operation, sustainability, and accessibility for visitors and sustainability impacts for the surrounding communities to Parks Canada. Great idea. Why aren't we looking at the fact that we've seen all these job losses and all these budget cuts to Parks Canada? And also, 2013, I mean, time passes, we did have a motion where we wanted to actually receive a briefing by the official Canadian delegation to the Climate Change Convention negotiations prior to the meetings in Warsaw in November 2013 to detail Canada's negotiating priorities. Sounds good to me. Well, we're still waiting for that briefing. It is 2014. I know. There's no point anymore. So we come out, and what's on the docket for us to study? Terrestrial conservation. Don't you wish you were on Environment Committee? Talk about demoralizing. I mean, I think that there are good reasons to talk about terrestrial conservation, but there are so many other issues, and we had already done 2 studies on conservation. So now we're doing terrestrial conservation, and that's what this report is that for which I've moved concurrence today. Terrestrial conservation. Why terrestrial conservation? Why not marine conservation? Oh, well, we wouldn't want to study marine conservation because then we would have to talk about fish habitat, right? This is a way of excluding the important legislation that government gutted, that government gutted back in 2012. And if you remember those budgets, this is important, Mr. Speaker. If you remember, there was a budget announcement in 2012, and then there were 2 bills that came after that in 2012. Those 2 bills, both of which passed, were remarkable in many ways. The fact that they were omnibus pieces of legislation. So the first one touched over 70 pieces of legislation. It amended or made changes, the same as amending, amended or repealed in some way or added to 70 pieces of legislation, all wrapped up in one bill that was over 400 pages long. Then we had a second one in the fall. So really significant. This is a little hobby horse of mine, the fact that the first bill, which is a budget bill, made changes to the Assisted Human Reproduction Act. So that whether or not I can be a surrogate, whether or not I can sell my eggs, was in a budget bill. My reproduction has nothing to do with the budget. And so we had these giant omnibus bills. What happened on environment? Well, a number of things. The Environmental Assessment Act was repealed. So it wasn't tweaked, it wasn't amended, it was pulled off the books and replaced with another one. What are the problems with it? Well, for example, we used to have a system called a trigger system with environmental assessments. So if there was a project that was happening and it touched a federal issue, like it touched somehow migratory birds or waterways that crossed provincial boundaries, it would trigger an environmental assessment. That kind of makes sense, right? You can wrap your head around why it would be that way. But now we have a list of these things mean environmental assessment, and if it's not on this list, there's no environmental assessment. Why is that a problematic thing? Well, think about something like the oil sands. If we had a definitive list 70 years ago, oil sands exploration would not have been on that list because we wouldn't have known it was in the realm of the possible. We wouldn't have considered, oh, and we should put oil sands development on this list. So a trigger is important because it's the situation that causes the assessment, not this definitive list. The other thing about the list is it's cabinet that makes up the list. This cabinet. It is trouble. It is trouble because the list is narrow. Do you know that seismic testing in the Gulf of St. Lawrence is not on that list? I think that's pretty problematic. So we have a movement from the trigger to the list. We also had the Environment Commissioner testify at committee about this list and the fact that we would no longer be doing these. There used to be 3 stages of environmental assessment, and the sort of the lowest stage was kind of like a paper stage. You just sort of submit documents and you get feedback on it, but it was still effective. Forgive me if I get the numbers a little bit wrong because I'm tapping into my memory here. But the Environment Commissioner, we asked him how many environmental assessments were being done, and he said, my memory says he said 4,000 to 6,000 per year. And so my next question was, and how many will be done now that the Environmental Assessment Act has been replaced in this new regime? And he said, 10 to 12. And I actually thought 10 to 12,000, and then I said, wait, 10 to 12,000? He said, no, 10 to 12 for the country. So incredible changes to our environmental assessment regime.
Oh, gosh.
It practically doesn't exist anymore. And there's also all these changes to consultation, where now you have to be directly affected. What does directly affected mean? If I live 10 kilometers downstream, am I directly affected? If I live 100 kilometers downstream, am I directly affected? If I'm a scientist who lives in Vancouver, who has expertise about the Douglas Channel, am I directly affected? There's no definition of this, and it completely curtails who can testify and be a party to these hearings. So in addition to changes to the Environmental Assessment Act in 2012, there were changes to the Fisheries Act. The Fisheries Act was one of our strongest pieces of environmental legislation that we had here in Canada because it talked about the protection of fish habitat. If we are going to protect our fish and our fisheries, we have to protect our fish habitat. Does make sense. Yeah. So what happened in 2012 was fish habitat was taken out, protection of fish habitat was taken out of the legislation. So what does that mean?
Incredible.
It is incredible. So now we're not protecting fish habitat, we're protecting fish, but not all fish. We're only going to protect fish. We're going to name them, and it's going to be fish that are of commercial significance, First Nations significance, and I'm forgetting the commercial, First Nations, and recreational, I believe.
And what about the other fish?
What about the other fish? That's a great question. They're not protected. What about the fish that the protected fish eat? They're not protected.
Oh.
What? And if you talk to anybody at Department of Fisheries and Oceans, they can't tell you what fish are on the list. It doesn't exist. They don't know what fish are protected.
Secret.
It's a secret fish are being protected. Their food stock is not being protected. So it is a conspiracy. We're not protecting fish. So you can destroy their food source. You can destroy their breeding grounds. You can have a fish with 3 heads. That's okay. As long as you don't kill it.
Oh.
But you can kill a lot of fish, just not the protected fish that don't exist, that are in secret. So it makes no sense, Mr. Speaker, that we have done this to one of our greatest environmental protections that we had. And here we are we did a study on terrestrial conservation. Why? Because we don't want to talk about fish habitat, because it agitates the conservatives when people come and say, that was a bad decision. We're not going to have a fishery anymore if we don't protect fish habitat. So we have this very narrow study on fish habitat. No, sorry, terrestrial habitat. I'm getting my words mixed up. So, the terrestrial habitat conservation in Canada report that came out, no mention of fish habitat. I will say, Mr. Speaker, the NDP, we were crafty, and we talked about sort of that liminal space between the terrestrial habitat and the marine habitat, and we sort of managed to get in some soggy land in some of the testimony. We tried. We're like, what about that soggy area in between the lakes and the land? And you know what? That soggy area can sometimes be fish habitat. So we were tricky, and we managed to get in some important information about fish habitat. We have a supplementary opinion to this report, Mr. Speaker. It is a dissenting opinion. It is on the record. It is worth a read. It is 2 pages. And I want to point out that one of the things we said clearly was there is no greater threat to our ecosystems or barrier to habitat conservation than climate change. There was significant consensus from witnesses on the need to address climate change issues in order to protect our biodiversity, but also to design strategies for habitat conservation and the preservation of biodiversity in the context of a changing climate. They can control the reports, they can control the outcome, they can control what it is that they say happened at committee, but you know what they can't change? They can't change committee witness testimony. They cannot change the fact that we had witnesses saying we need to address climate change if we're going to do anything about habitat conservation in Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Bravo! Bravo!
Questions and comments. Castelli Kamantai, the honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I acknowledge almost the standing ovation from the NDP caucus towards the member's speech, and no doubt it had, I must say, no doubt it, as you can see, they're quite excited about this particular issue. One could maybe ask why it is that they wouldn't be as excited about the numerous other agenda items that are actually before us and the many other concurrence reports. And it's not to take anything away from the environment, Mr. Speaker, conservation. Those are very important issues, and I don't question that. You know, Mr. Speaker, I enjoy the opportunity to be able to debate on a wide variety of issues, and including this one here. I can tell you, in terms of going through the many different concurrence reports that are out there, that there are a number of them that are very significant, and I would love to be able to see more discussions and debates on concurrence. The question that I have for the member is in regards to when you think about the environment and you think about conservation. When it comes down to ranking in terms of priorities, I'm wondering if the NDP felt that this particular motion of concurrence, it would have been a good opportunity to talk about what is a very topical issue in Canada today, and that's the pipeline, the Northern Gateway pipeline. And if, in fact, this is something that we should be trying to facilitate more of a debate here today on, just given the impact that it's having on our environment. And conservationists are very much concerned in regards to this. And I couldn't help but notice, just given how big of an issue it is, that the member never made any reference to that and the impact that it had on conservation here in Canada, and if she might want to just provide some feedback on pipelines.
Good question.
The honourable member for Halifax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his question. I will answer it, but I want to get to first why it would be that I would move a concurrence motion on this. You know what, Mr. Speaker, any chance that we can have to talk about climate change in this House is a chance that I will take. We have a Minister of Environment who, until I asked her a direct question in the House after her appointment, had never uttered the words climate change publicly that we can find on the record. So any moment that I have to talk about climate change, which I think is the most important issue facing us today, when I was appointed the environment critic by Jack Layton, I said, what's my mandate? And he said, climate change. This is the thing you have to work on. This is the most important thing. So in that, there are other important things going on. And so the question about pipelines is really relevant. One thing I didn't talk about in my speech was how agitated the Conservatives would get anytime someone talked about the Species at Risk Act. It was like they were visibly starting to twitch because they don't want to talk about that act. And that's directly related to pipelines and also oil and gas exploration generally. If we look at the sage grouse, I think there are 12 sage grouse left in Alberta. And why? Because they need big spaces to roam, and those big spaces are being interrupted by oil and gas development. We look at something like pipelines and the fact that it can bifurcate the existing grazing area of caribou, which are species at risk. But the Conservatives don't want to talk about this, and I think that when we talk about conservation, especially terrestrial conservation, we have to talk about the full ecosystem, which includes animals, and I think we did miss an opportunity to talk about the impact of pipelines on our conservation efforts.
Questions and comments? Question come on tide. The honourable member for Jean Lebert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable colleague from Halifax, she spoke in her very eloquent, very beautiful speech on environment. She spoke about, she touched on the link of species in regards to their existence, but also our existence. The fact that because certain fish are not listed as protection, these are the fish or the food source for other fish. She just mentioned the fact that caribou lands are being threatened. Thus, it threatens the existence of the caribou, which threatens the existence and the livelihood of our First Nations brothers and sisters. I would love if she would take a moment and just expand on that theory, because our colleagues from across the way seem to feel that it's okay not to think of the big picture, to just kind of pull a few things that make money out of the works of nature, and everything else go to blazes, as my grandmother would say. I'm hoping that's not non-parliamentary language, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for Jean Lebert for his question and also his incredible advocacy on environment in this House. He stands up for the interests of his constituents. They care very much about environment, as does he. And he brings up a good point about the fact that it's not about a species. It's not about a tiny tract of land that we can protect. It is about these full ecosystems. As I said earlier, how can we protect a fish if we're not protecting its habitat, if we're not protecting the fish that it eats or its other food sources? There is a chain here, and we have to look at things in this chain, in this holistic way. I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to something like fish habitat, and we heard very quick testimony at committee during those omnibus budgets and the changes to the Fisheries Act. We heard quick testimony. We were sitting till quite late at night. There was limited amount of time and limited number of witnesses that we could actually bring to testify. But we brought those witnesses, and some of them representing credible scientific-based organizations said the answer is no. The answer isn't make an amendment to this. The answer is no. You cannot make this change about protecting fish habitat. And so we did the responsible thing, and we moved amendments. I can't remember how many, hundreds. There were hundreds of amendments, and not one was accepted, not a single one. So we do our due diligence on this side, but unfortunately the Conservatives aren't listening.
Questions and comments? Question come on tide. L'honorable député de Berthier-Masquinonge.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. I really enjoyed the passionate speech and words from my colleague and all the work she does for the environment and with the environment team. I'm just wondering if she can comment on when we formed government in 2015. Because the Conservatives are, considered an endangered species nowadays. What she would put top of mind, not just climate change, but also would like to note there are a lot of students here and youth I see up top in the galleries listening to us, and I know environment is very top of mind, and preserving our country and making it a better place, and making sure that we do our best and we address climate change. And I was just wondering if she can comment on what she would do as Environment Minister, potentially, in 2015.
Here, here. The honourable member for Halifax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That makes me a little bit shy. I thank my colleague for her question, and also for the great work that she does standing up for her constituents here in the House. She talks to me a lot. We sit close to each other. She talks to me a lot about environment and the hopes and the passions of her constituents around the issue of environment. 2015, yes. First up on the endangered species list would be Conservative MPs. It's easy enough to talk about some of the big picture visionary things that we would do. For example, we would put a price on carbon. We would bring back the Eco-Energy Home Retrofit Program. We would take that $1.3 billion in subsidies to oil and gas companies. oil and gas companies who do not need our help to make money, and we would transfer that money to the new, incredible, innovative startups in the green tech industry. Why are we subsidizing companies that are making billions of dollars and not giving that leg up to those great new startups in the green tech world that will help us make that transition to the green energy economy? Some of this is a little tougher, right? When it comes to SEA, the Environmental Assessment Act, would we bring back the old bill? Well, there were actually problems with the old bill, and so what we would do is make sure that we consulted with people and consulted with scientists and consulted with experts and take that evidence before we make those decisions. It will be tough, Mr. Speaker, mark my words, because government has done a fantastic job of absolutely gutting our scientific capacity. So it's going to be hard, because I don't know that we have the scientific capacity right now. So we need to start with rebuilding that scientific capacity and then taking that information and actually making changes to legislation. Thank you.
Resuming debate.